The September 24th Westfield Washington School Board of School Trustees budget hearing and board meeting is now in session. Since we have a quorum, please stand for a moment of silence and the Pledge of Allegiance. All right, for the 2025 budget hearing, we will turn things over to Brian Tomomichael.
Thank you. So I know we have a lot of other stuff to go through tonight, so I'm going to make this as efficient as possible. But we do have several slides to kind of go through to give you an outline of 2025's budget, talk a little bit about kind of this year's budget as well. So reminder of budget timeline. It's kind of about a 6-month process for us, really. We start back in June 30th. We have pre-submit documentation to DLGF. August, we receive our net assessed value from the county and the state that kind of tells us how much as a district we grew when it looks at assessed value or kind of property value. And then from July to August, we really get everything put into Gateway. This year, September 10th is when we advertised our budget online. And then at the budget hearings tonight on the 24th, budget adoption will be in October. We then have 2 days to get everything submitted to the state, and then in December, the state will send us our approved budget back with final approvals and kind of final tweaks if we need anything once it's done. Budget process is really 18-month forecast of spending and revenues and expenditures. We'd have to do a capital expenditure plan and a 5-year bus replacement plan, which will be shown as well. Budget must be presented within state guidelines. We advertise, have the public hearing and adoption. And then as a reminder, once advertised, we cannot raise the rates or raise our levies, so we always advertise high and expect those to come down, and we show that in here as well. And then a reminder of our funds. So we have to advertise our state and local funds within our budget. So our education fund is state funds, and it's all funded through basically the dollars per child. So when you hear the state legislators talk about the school budgeting at the state level, or the 50% goes to K-12, that is the fund that they're talking about in the education fund. And then our local, or our debt service and operations funds are local and within kind of your normal state budget. And then our operating referendum, our capital referendum are those approved referendums from the city themselves as we run those locally. Those also then come from local property tax dollars, but they are above the cap. A couple budget definitions. Levy is basically the actual property tax that will be collected. Appropriations is our permission to spend. The budget we present tonight will not necessarily match the appropriations or approval to spend from the state as we go through that. And then our budget calendar for the school, although we operate a school year, more of a July through June period, our actual budget is calendar year, so they do not align perfectly. So the budget you're looking at is a January 1 through December 31 budget. So let's look at the budget. So advertised budgets for this year, education fund is about $81 million. The operating referendum, 13.5. Debt service is advertised at 52. Capital referendum is 6.9, and operations fund is 32 million. So again, we advertise high, so a total budget about 185 million. But when we look at kind of the actual projected of where we actually expect those budget numbers to come in at, once we go through the state portion of it, is roughly remaining education at 81. Operating referendum, we'll get into some more conversation on that, but we are capped by the state on how much it can grow. So that number will be closer to 11.5. Debt service, we will do some debt issuance at the end of this year for kind of this first phase of Destination Westfield that we just had a groundbreaking for. So once that's in, we expect that to be closer to 48 million. Capital referendum, we know exactly what that debt payment is. That is the renovations back in 2018 to intermediate, middle, and high school that occurred. So that rate is set for a long, several years to come at 6.9 million, which is the debt payment. And then operations, again, is capped by the state. We expect that to be closer to 27 million. So our actual budget of where we expect to be after everything's said and done is about 174, almost 175 million. So we look at stuff, one of the big factors that drives in our education fund is really our enrollment. So as you look at this chart, every orange bar is how much we have grown every year in students, and the blue line is our percentage change year by year. So if you look at Kind of towards the left end, you can see 4 very large spikes in a row, and that's the last 4 years that we've been through. We are up roughly 420 kids this year, and over the last 4 years, since the 21-22 school year, we are up 1,657 students. To put that into context, that is a larger enrollment than our intermediate school. That is a larger enrollment than our high school. So we have grown a significant amount of kids in just 4 years. And then every single year, this tracks back to 2001, 2002, we have grown in student population. Even during our COVID year in 2020, 2021, when most schools actually lost students, we gained 50 kids that year. So truly, we have grown every year, which I think is probably the only school district in the state that can say that. And then as we go into the future, we really don't foresee that slowing down either as we continue to move forward. Part of what we'll talk about as well is back in 2018, the state did changed from what used to be the general fund, and we had a bus replacement, a transportation, and a capital projects fund to an education operations fund. And within that, the state allows up for a 15% transfer of revenue that goes into our now education fund, into our operations fund. We just like to point out every year that while the state allows 15%, as a district, we only transfer 7%. Really what that means is more of our dollars stay in the classroom every year because of that lower transfer rate than what the state allows. So we look at our education fund and how we spend our dollars. If you look at 72 and that 16%, so about 88% of our dollars are spent on salary and benefits. The education fund, those are only employees that basically work with your kid every day. So anybody who is in that building, from your principal, your counselor, down to your teacher, your IAs, all come out of the education fund. What does not come out of the education fund is your central office staff or any of your overall district leaders, or your custodial, grounds, maintenance, technology staff. None of that comes out of the education fund. So when we look at that and we see that you have your 7%, which is being transferred to your operations fund we just talked about. Really that leaves about 93% of the fund left to spend. 88% of that is for staff and salaries. So when we look at that of how are we sending dollars to the classroom, we are putting people in the classroom every day. With that, then we often talk about we fully maximize the education fund, and it's a lot of people, and we actually overspend that side of it when we look at including the operating referendum side. So again, if you remember, the operating referendum was about 11.5 million is where we expect it to be this next year. And even in the operating referendum, we push a lot of our teacher and teacher benefits into the operating referendum that would otherwise be in the education fund. So about 54%, or if you look at what we spend, roughly $5 million of our operating referendum every year is for teacher benefits. So if we did not have that operating referendum, we look back at the education fund, we would overspend our education fund every single year without the referendum. So in order to maintain our class sizes, maintain the number of students or staff members that we have working with our kids every day, that operating referendum is absolutely required to be there. The other thing I would point out when you look at your operating referendum, you look at that 28% and that 16%, those are your utilities, those are your maintenance costs, those are other expenses that would otherwise fall into our operations fund. So when we go back and we look at that 7% and we transfer less than the 15%, if we did not have our operating referendum, that 7% would immediately become 15% tomorrow in order to make sure that we could afford those utilities that can't go away. So when we look at the operating referendum, we say we have to have this continue to operate the way we operate. It is absolutely necessary. If you were to remove the operating referendum tomorrow, immediately you have $11 million of necessities that have to change and have to go back. You cannot just not pay utilities tomorrow. So really when you look at that, what's going to change? What would have to change if you did not have the operating referendum is staff. That's what would have to change across the district. So I know that gets talked about sometimes, and we want to know how do we utilize the funds. It truly allows more teachers and more support staff to be in our classrooms every day. A couple things I'd point out. So when we ran the operating referendum last time, we lowered it. Originally, the very first operating referendum was at 23 cents. We then lowered it to 20 cents as a district. This last time we went through and we lowered it to 17 cents. At that next year, we saw assessed value across the state go up large amounts. Generally for the state and most school districts across the state, that was a very, very large increase. For us, it was not a very large increase compared to where we've normally been. But because of that change, the state came through and put a 3% growth cap on our operating referendum last year. So that took our 17-cent approved rate down to 15.28 cents. So we lost last year almost $1.1 million in what was approved by the community for us to collect. Now, moving into the 2025 budget, the state has changed, and we still have a cap, and this year, because of there's a factor if you can be between 6 cents or 12 cents, and because of our growth, we're allowed to be a 12% growth. The problem is we grew at 16% as a community. So while you have a cap of 12, we still grew at 16%. So that means our rate, again, this year will fall. So from the 17 cents to the 15 cents, we will now be down to 14.7 cents. To put that in perspective, we will be almost $1.7 million lower than if we had the 17 cents that was approved by our community. So that has put a huge constraint on our budget. And again, as we talk through about how this allows our education fund and our operations fund to function and flow without making cuts, we have to make up that $1.7 million difference because we cannot grow at the same rate in which we're growing as a district because the state has put caps on us. So, and I have a section later that talks about legislation. We'll dive into some of that a little bit more as well. Our debt service fund, so again, our debt service fund is basically like your mortgage payments for the district, so it's how we pay for a lot of the new buildings that we're putting up, the renovations of the buildings that we go through as well. With the rapid growth comes the need for new buildings and in turn increased debt. I will say we look at projections far out into the future to 2040 and beyond. So when we are building these projects and kind of plugging in our debt payments for these projects we're building, it is not just a wild pie in the sky guess. We know exactly how these projects are filling certain holes and filling our capacity for our debt service as we move forward. So as we look at kind of the chart, and you'll see that our debt service levy, so how much are we bringing in to pay off debt every year, shoots up and kind of levels off, and that will eventually be basically a straight line across as we work through that. And then our debt service rate will remain really right around that 60 cents as we look into the future as well. I know it looks like it drops off a little bit on this chart, but that's because there are some pieces that we're leaving flexibility for in the future as we look out. Specific to Destination Westfield and everything that's going on right now, I just kind of wanted to use this opportunity to just give kind of a quick project update. So completed projects, Cary Ridge is completed, tennis courts are completed. We are still working on the team building that should be completed towards the end of the year. Under construction, transportation, the expansion of the early learning center that we're in right now. And then also we just had the groundbreaking for Westfield Middle School. So if you go out there, dirt's moving. Breaking ground soon, Midland and Shamrock. You'll be approving both of those bids tonight. And Shamrock Station will break ground actually next week. And then kind of the coming soon is the Westfield Operations Center, which is our current transportation center. And then also our Westfield High School expansion, which will be performing arts in that south locker room, but also increased academic space on the second and third floors of those buildings. And then I wanted to touch briefly on kind of just project finances. So if you remember December 2023, we brought this to the board. We had our prelim hearings on all the projects. They were approved, so we had total project cost at that time at $460 million. Cost of issuance and interest at that time we projected to be about $27.5 million to give a total resolution price of $487.5 million. As we've worked through this, we knew that our interest was overstated with where we were, but the problem with we didn't know exactly when we would sell those bonds, how we'd structure those bonds, or even what the market would look like at that time. So as we've kind of gone through this past year and we have a lot of those questions answered, we're kind of able to start filling in some of the holes of what we planned for versus where we're at today. And with that, we've worked really hard to make sure that all of our projects stay within the budgets that they have. As we work through that, and what it has allowed us to do as we now know more of what the market is, what our interest rates will look like, what our bond structure will look like, you'll notice that the cost of issuance has gone down from $27.5 million in interest down to $10.6 million. So what that's really allowed us to do is as we look at the operation building, or really what it is the remodel of our current transportation center, is when we originally went into this, we expected that project to fall under a future bond issuance. However, because of what we've been able to do with the help of Stiefel and our bond council and all those groups, we've actually been able to fit that project within that original $487.5 million that was approved. So we will be able to basically do a completely extra project within the original approval amount, and continue to stay financially responsible and fiscally responsible as we move forward with those. We have plenty of needs in the district as we move forward, so we don't want to just push that along because it will affect how's our future debt capacity work out, but we feel like being able to absorb that project within this original approved amount already allows us to continue to function in a better capacity as we move forward. So capital referendum, as we talked about, so capital referendum I believe was approved at the end of 2016, early 2017. It was for the remodel of the intermediate, middle, and high school at that time in 2018. That capital referendum was approved at a max of $90 million in projects, or 30 cents. So it was the max of whichever max was hit first. So we issued the $9 million in debt back in 2018 and accomplished all those projects. The repayment of that $90 million runs through 2038, which is the length of that referendum, but that repayment does not change. So as you'll see, we were never at 30 cents on this referendum. We were at 16.55 cents way back when. 2024, we were at just above 10 cents, and when we get into 2025, we'll actually be below that and be around 9 cents as we move forward. That amount, as we continue to grow as a district, will just become a lower and lower tax rate every year as we move forward until the bonds are completely paid off in 2038. People often ask, can we collect extra in this fund? And the answer is no. The only thing we can collect is to make that bond payment and nothing else. So as we get to the end of the time, there is a little bit of money that sits in the bank from the tax collections on this side. That will be absorbed into that final payment, and there will be nothing additional for the district once it's all said and done. As we look at our operations fund, so again, we have our education, really operations fund. While education fund is pretty much everything in the classroom, your operations fund is really everything that keeps the district running outside of the classroom. So you have your salary and benefits of kind of all your non-building levels. So again, your tech, your ground maintenance, transportation staff, you have your utilities, you have your bus replacement. The next few slides that we'll get to in a second will show the capital projects plan for the year. And then what's on our website is our bus replacement plan for the year, which is $2.1 million in new buses for next year. So we continue to expand our fleet as we continue to grow every year. Just so you know, we do work with CISC on their bus bids within that. So we work with our transportation department to pick out the bus that is going to be the lowest when we look at making sure our buses, as we move forward, have AC on them. And then also have a few other factors that we just require as a district to have on our bus. Also, when you look at this, I will point out the blue and the orange, so about 41% of our operations fund is salary of people. When you look at your 700, or that 13%, kind of that dark blue at the top, that is really going to be a lot of your school bus purchases, and that 22%, or that yellow triangle, is really mostly utilities. So when you look, those are big chunks of things that are required to happen, and that just have to occur as a district. So there's not fluff in the operations fund. I think, we were talking earlier at the groundbreaking. I think people often miss, we are heating and cooling well over 1 million square feet of property every day. Our standard classroom is 900 square feet. So if you take 2 classrooms, that is really your average home size. And most of our buildings have 40 of those. So when you look at you think about it in that manner, and you think about how many homes are we heating and cooling every day, how many kids are we transporting every day? And as Mike Hall likes to say, in transportation is the one business where you have to have 100% success rate. You can't lose a kid, so 99% doesn't pass. There's a lot that goes into the operations of our buildings and making everything go every day, making sure that we know sometimes we're late and we're working on that and we're trying to make it better, but we also want to make sure that we're safe in everything that we do. So as we look at the capital projects plan and really kind of what are our acquisitions as we move into this next year, we have to list any project or any purchase that will be over $10,000 that is paid for out of the operations fund. I caveat that piece because as we look at all these projects that are happening right now, those are not paid for out of the operations fund, so they do not have to be reported on this list. So these are just the assets being purchased out of operations. So as we continue to grow as a district, we continue to increase our maintenance and our ground staff as well, continue to take care of more property and more square footage every year. So we'll be looking to add 2 more maintenance vans, 2 more mowers, a grounds truck. As we look at kind of the projects as a whole, we have just general asphalt fill at some of the schools, high school boiler, air handlers, our renewal, which is really a renewal of the whole cooling system, and then lovely more HVAC items as we look at Maple Glen, Washington Woods Middle School, water heaters at Oak Trace and Monon, wireless upgrades to our technology system, network switches across the district, and then upgrading a lot of our security cameras as we continue to work through. This list does evolve and change throughout the year as we continue to go and grow, and we continue to keep an eye on that with the help of Dan Britta, Mike Hall, Brian Kelly, Luke Hildebrand as we work through a lot of those pieces. We do have a rainy day fund. We do not allocate a budget for the rainy day fund. As we say every year, rainy days are meant for rainy days. When those times come, we want to make it a little bit more difficult on ourselves so that we have to bring an additional appropriation to the board and work through those items at that time when they're necessary, and we do not like to allocate dollars during the budget process from our rainy day. So I know this is small, but this is really looking at kind of our tax rate for the last several years and where we expect to be as we look into this year. So we look at 2022, we were at $1.40. This current year, we're at $1.27. So our advertised rate is $1.33. Again, we advertise high. We expect that to come low. Our goal is to keep our rate completely flat this year, and really a large portion of that is as we continue to grow and expand as a district in our projects, we do have increased debt as we add those buildings on. So you'll see that our debt service rate is what will actually go up from a 64 cents to 67 cents as we move forward, where all of our other funds are actually dropping a little bit over the time. And then circuit breaker impact. So if you remember, your house, you pay 1%, commercial property is 3%, rental and farmland is 2%. So with that, there is a finite amount of money that is within the system. So when you have library, township, fire, schools, city, all overlapping entities, quite frankly, there is more pull on that bucket of funds available than what is available. So we do lose money to circuit breaker every year. So we looked at, back in 2020, we lost about $7.5 million to circuit breaker. Part of the reason why we have encouraged our rate to drop the last several years, and even if you look back further back, we used to be over $2 of a tax rate, and that is because we need our circuit breaker to decrease, and the only way to decrease a circuit breaker is to maintain or lower our tax rate every year and put less pressure on that kind of finite revenue source. So as we look at 2024, projecting about a $5.5 million circuit breaker loss, and we'll expect to see that again in 2025. And then tax rate, just looking overall, so 2019, when we brought on the capital referendum, was kind of the spike in the most kind of recent history. And then again, as you look forward from really 2024 on, we are projecting to maintain that flat at basically $1.27 as we continue to move into the future. I always like to point out, we do work heavily with city and the school district, a lot of partnerships. We do have roughly a quarter of the meetings with kind of finance departments. We share gas purchases, school resource officers. We work traffic control. We just approved last board meeting, continue to work heavily with that, and then paper purchasing as a whole. We've also had a lot of conversations with the city as we both continue to grow around land as well, and who owns what, and how can we partner together to make sure that we're having, quite frankly, our resources in the same area, and even share some costs as we develop some future sites. So changing legislation, this kind of jumps back to the operating referendum side of things. So as we looked in 2024, our operating referendum was capped at 3%. That year, Westfield grew 14%. So that cap of 3% cost us $1.1 million in lost revenue this past year. As we look forward, the operating referendum this year is capped at a 6 to 12% rate based on your student enrollment growth. So we will be at the max of that because our enrollment growth, so we will grow at 12%. However, Westfield grew at 15.4%. So when you compound a smaller number last year is now going to grow a smaller number than what we should grow again, our rate will actually decrease, and it compounds the impact on us as a district. So this year we will lose basically $1.7 million compared to where we should be if we were to fully receive that operating referendum that was approved by the community. And then not only was it hit on the operating referendum side, we were also hit pretty hard on our operations fund side. So our operations fund, if we went back to the 2023 calendar year, we were allowed as a rapidly growing district in the state of Indiana to grow at basically twice the growth rate of the state. So even though we were growing at 14%, 15%, we could grow at 8%, which was basically double the state growth rate. The state came in 2024 and said that language is no longer valid. You can only grow at the state growth rate, which is about 4%. So again, we're growing at 14%, 15%. We get to grow at 4%. The impact of that just last year was about $830,000. This year it ends up being about $1.2 million on us as well. So when you add those two together, we are losing close to $3 million in our 2025 budget compared to legislative language that was in place as recently as 2023. So if we think back again to how are we spending our funds, where are those going? While we are growing quickly, those have impacts, and those are changes that we have to make as we continue to operate, and we can't continue to operate the same way as we did back in 2023 with the constraints that are put on us. A couple other things I like to put into place. So, we're capped at a 3%. and a 5%. If we look at inflation over the last 4 years, it's been anywhere from 5, 8, 3, 2% when I pull this in July. And so you look at that change in our cost, and then you look at the fact of how much we're growing in enrollment has been 4, 4, 5, and 4%. And you look at we're capped at 3% and 4%. Not only can we not only keep up with inflation during that time in the growth of our budget, we can't even keep up with our enrollment growth during that time in our budget. So we are truly generally one of the fastest growing districts in the state, but the problem is when we legislate for the whole, it impacts us extremely negatively. So part of what we do every year is we work with Policy Analytics, and with Policy Analytics, they look at really where's our assessed value growth. They break it down for us in different ways. And one thing we asked for in poll this year, being a rapidly growing community is, while we're growing, 23% in 2023, we grew 14.3% in 2024. What's the makeup of that growth? So, if you talk downtown at the State House, they will say, well, your existing homeowner saw all that increase and they're going to see all that tax burden come on them. In your average Indiana community who isn't growing at our rate, that's a pretty true statement. However, for Westfield, this is looking all the way back to 2015. Almost every single year that's listed here, the orange bar is the growth in our assessed value because of brand new homes. So when we look at 2024 and we grew 14.3%, over 50% of that growth, or 7.8%, is because we have brand new homes being built in our district. Only 6.5% of that growth is coming from existing homes. So our argument to the State House is we should be allowed to capture our new growth in Westfield. We should be allowed to capture the full 7.8%. When we look at growth caps, when we look at how do we want to constrain the growth of existing, we can have that conversation. We're open to that. But that means we should be talking about how do we constrain the 6.5% growth and then give us full access to the 7.8% growth. And we want to show you several years because this is not an outlier for Westfield. If you look back to 2015, we grew 7%. It was truly 50-50. 3.5 from new homes, 3.5 was from existing homes. So we routinely, because of our growth, are seeing more new homes built every year, which is putting a huge influx to our assessed valuation, but yet we're being capped on how we can grow, which we don't believe is fair for us as a district. So the other growth problem that we run into, I always like to point out, is just the growing school problem. So to give you an example, the growing school problem is October 1st of 2024, a new family builds a home, moves into Westfield. October 13th, those students show up to school. They enroll, they take a bus, they meet the teacher, take their seat. The issue in Indiana is, let's say October 2nd that year was count day. So those students showed up after count day. Because they showed up after count day, we don't have our second count day till roughly February 15th of the following year. Once they're actually counted February 15th, then it's about May when we actually receive funding for those students. So we go from October 13th of educating those students to not receiving funding until we get to May 15th. The other issue, if we look back to most of our new students are coming from brand new homes, because they build a brand new home, that home is not actually added onto the assessed valuation until February or fall of 2025, meaning we don't see our first tax revenue until almost 2 years after that student moved here in June of 2026. And then, also as we talked, we're also capped on that. So we don't even get to see the full growth of that. So, I talked to a lot of other CFOs around the state, and I will be, the common misperception with Westfield is, oh, you're growing so fast, how great it must be, you must be flush with cash. There is definitely a growth problem. When you grow so fast, part of it is we are constrained with lagging revenues with the expectation of the expense happening day one. So part of that means is we have more staff than what we're receiving the revenue for because we have more kids than what we're receiving the revenue for. So we're constantly at constraint within that process. And we do the best we can, but sometimes when we talk about, hey, we need to constrain a budget a little bit, we need to hold back a little bit, part of this is a big lead into why, and then part of the caps are also a lead into why as well. So summary of the budget as a whole, ignore that since 2014 at the top, don't know where that's from. Since 2014, our budget has decreased 84 cents, or about 40% reduction. During that same time period, our enrollment has increased 50%, or about 3,300 kids. $1 in 2014 is worth $1.33 today. So really inflation has been about 33% since 2014 as well. So while our budget has decreased, our enrollment has increased, and our buying power has actually decreased, or inflation has gone up. So truly, we are trying to do more with less every single day as we move forward. And then looking at kind of the budget for this year as a whole, again, we're advertising at $185 million. In 2024, we advertised at $1.35, came in at $1.27. 2025, we're advertising at $1.33, again, expect to come in at $1.27. And then we'd just like to point out our referendum rate is roughly 24 cents when we look at our operating and capital combined. And then our kind of non-exempt or our debt and capital or operations fund rate makes up about $1.03 as we move forward. So happy to answer any questions. I know I went through that rather fast, but I know we have other stuff to do tonight as well.
Yeah, Brian, thank you. You know, my company, I have a CFO, and I feel like there's CFOs for companies, and then there's CFO for schools, and I'm not sure how you guys do it. There's just so much to keep track of. You know, with my company, it's money comes in, and we can budget for it, and, you know, whether we deal with income or cuts every year, it's pretty self-explanatory, but this is just not that. So yeah, just thanks for all the good work you and your team do. Can you explain, you know, when you were using the word caps a lot, and I feel like a lot of us in Indiana, we understand the property tax caps, but now there are growth caps. And so can you just explain that a little bit more? That was one I was having trouble following.
Yeah, so the growth cap is really more of a holistic look of items. So if we were valued at $1 million overall of Westfield last year, and we grew the 15%, so now we should be at 1.15. The state's saying, yes, you're at 1.15, but none of your budgets can grow over 3%. So what that causes then is it pushes our tax rate down because it says we can only collect so much out of that. So we are not able to recognize that other growth that would have been there.
And that was, that's new as of the last 1 or 2 years?
Yeah, so that is really in response to 2023 when everybody saw their assessed valuation across the state grow double digits, which for a lot of places, you know, I know a lot of people there, AV usually grows at 3% and they grew at 25% that year. And it was truly a very, very large outlier. For us, our average AV growth year over year right now is about 11%. So when you compare that, we did grow 23% that year, so it was double our normal growth, but a double growth year is not that extreme when we look at everything else. But from a state level, they're looking at statewide data that shows, you know, a 3, 4, 5 times growth, and they're responding to that. I will tell you there's a lot of information out there, though. If we go back from when property tax caps were put in place and the growth since that time over the last roughly 20 years, and you even factor in the 2023 spike year, property taxes over the last 20 years have only increased about 3% net over that time. So even with that spike of a year, it really just normalized the data over that time frame. However, understandably, we see a huge spike in your taxes that year. That's what gets a pull and a response. So just so you guys know, October 8th will be our budget adoption. So if you have any questions, let me know between now and then, and we can happy to answer them. And then at October 8th, we'll have about 10 resolutions like we usually do that go along with the budget to approve everything else as well.
I take that back. I got one question. On the trucks that we're getting and everything else, with the new buildings we're getting, they're not just gonna be used for maintenance or whatever. I mean, they're gonna be used for shipping. Like, we're gonna have a certain place where we store all the paper and then dish it out to the schools and stuff like that.
Yeah. So we have all of our paper right now. So we rent the current tractor, the old Tractor Supply building next to the highway by the Kawasaki dealership, I think.
Yep.
So we rent that. So a lot of our deliveries end up there. So part of the maintenance guys' duties during if they have a shipment that needs to go somewhere, they'll load up in their truck and take it. So they'll go to the site and move everything around the district as a whole.
Okay. So it's just not just for maintenance or just for grounds. I mean, it's being used for the whole school system.
Yeah, I mean, I would tell you it is just for maintenance and grounds, but our maintenance and grounds are the guys who are performing those duties.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had another one. Brian, how much is in the rainy day fund right now, and if we had to use that recently?
So we haven't used it recently. We've had conversations about the change in textbook rental, which we'll continue talking about the next few months. I believe we have about 6.2 in there right now as we use it. And what we've talked as the Finance Committee about is if we have to utilize those funds, we also will be looking at bringing a resolution to the board to pay those funds back as well when we utilize them during that time frame as well.
Okay, thank you, Brian, for explaining very well, very simple terms. It's much appreciated. So at this time, we do not have any comments, correct? Okay, so at this time, we will close the budget for 2025 hearing and then open a brief regular meeting to follow. Okay, do I have to do it again? We've already called the meeting to order, so now we will proceed with our brief regular board meeting this evening. We do not have any comment cards, so we will move right along. The only item on the regular board meeting agenda tonight is the Midland Crossing Elementary and Shamrock Springs Elementary bids, which Brian Tom Michael will present.
Different seat, same voice. So I'd like to first welcome Cindy and Anne Marie and Mitch with Garmong and Schmidt. So they are architect and CM on this project. So since really December 23 or before, we've been working with both companies to bring our two new elementaries together. So this is the replacement of Shamrock Springs Elementary and then Midland Elementary, which will be on 171st and Town Road. We are presenting both projects really as one holistic project today on both elementaries. So if you remember up on the board, we had 80 million and 83 million listed. So holistically, we're presenting these projects as $163 million as we move forward. So we are looking to ask for approval of the Midland and the Shamrock projects for a price not to exceed the $163 million. We are currently working with the city to hopefully get some early site work approval to start moving dirt on Midland sooner than later. And then Shamrock is not delayed, but there's a separation of a few months between Midland and Shamrock on our building schedule to have those completed as well. So happy to answer any questions. I want to give a lot of credit to both Schmidt and Garmong. It's been I will call it a stressful 2 weeks as we look just at the bid market and where our bids did come in a little high, so we did have to value engineer some stuff, but everything that anybody in the community has seen as the design of the building is staying intact. Really, it's mostly, what type of ceiling tile do you see, which in the long term doesn't affect a whole lot other than just a little bit of visual appeal on the inside. So we're excited to get both these projects underway and excited to have Midland opening for the 26-27 school year and Shamrock not far behind that during the same school year.
Thank you. At this time, I'll entertain a motion to approve the Midland Crossing and Shamrock Springs bids as presented.
So moved.
Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Thank you, Jimmy and Mike. It has been moved and seconded to approve the Midland Crossing and Shamrock Springs bids. Is there any discussion or any questions at this time? Mike?
How much did you make in savings as far as changing out the aesthetics, like the ceiling tiles and stuff like that?
So we were, about 3 million over in total that we had to change. And what we want to be really cognizant of is that both buildings stayed identical. So we want to make sure that any changes we made to one happened to the other as well, which is really why we kind of started to look at the projects holistically. But then there was a lot of legwork put in by Garmong. There was a lot of work put in by Schmidt to make sure that we weren't changing anything that would actually affect the building long-term, but also making sure that really the educational space in the building is by far the most important part of the building. So we want to make sure that that stayed in place as well. And then it wasn't just, Brian Kelly and I sitting in the room with them. Dr. Atha was there, Dr. Kaiser was there as well for part of the conversations as we ran through those lists.
This has more to do with the timeline of things. I know the city's just purchased the corner of 161st and Spring Mill to, eventually put a roundabout in there. Obviously, that's close to where Shamrock Springs is. So is there any concern with timelines being affected because of potential traffic issues or?
No, we should be okay on that. I mean, the city does as good as they can on making sure we're updated on all those and making sure our traffic routes stay open. And while construction of a major intersection like that's never enjoyable, they usually do a pretty good job of trying to do that during the major sections during non-school times. So it's the minimal effect as possible, but we should be okay.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
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 Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca. All opposed, say no. Motion passes. All right. Now the meeting is over, so can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?